The Ballad of Derpy Hooves by Docboy,
I've seen her crash like that all the time.
cackled Tiara as she shoved Dinky to the ground. Dinky's head connected with the hard dirt that threw up dust in her eyes. The concoction of debris and her crushed feelings yielded a gracious river of streaming tears from a white sea veined a bloodshot red.
You shut up about my mommy!
Dinky sobbed as she tried to get up.
Or what?
Silver Spoon snickered.
Is she gonna look at us with those eyes of hers?
She fell on her back, uncontrollably laughing. Tiara followed suit.
How about those bubbles on her flanks? Who would want those as a cutie mark?
Mocked Tiara.
I guess her special talent was so useless she had to take that postmare job to scrap together a living.
Answered Silver Spoon with a fake sympathy in her voice.
Gee, Dinky.
She continued.
It must be so humiliating having a moron for a mom, eh?
Said Silver Spoon with a malicious, sadistic grin on her face. Dinky only stepped backwards with a frown and tears rolling down her cheeks. Her watery eyes were as wide as saucers. The clique's laughter rung in her ears as she ran crying all the way home. This wasn't the first time she had endured her friend's insults. Dinky shoved the door to her house open, almost jarring it off its hinges as it hit the wall, sending a few pictures to the ground off their hooks. She ran inside, slammed it closed, and flung herself onto the small divan by the window as she buried her face into a pillow, dampening it with her sorrows. She heard the sudden sound of somebody's hoof reverberating off the walls by the upstairs hallway. Dinky turned around to see that it was her mother, who wore a concerned look on her face, with her tagged mail satchel on her back that read, "Did she H?" Dinky ran over to her mother and nuzzled her face into her chest as she poured out the day's sob story.
And then they pushed me to the ground because they said you look funny, Mommy!
Cried Dinky, looking up at Ditsy's unforgettable eyes. One eye focused on her, but the other rolled off in a complimentary angle. Even so, a sad look washed over her as she closely held her sobbing daughter to her chest. She lightly tapped Dinky's shoulder to prompt her to look up. She stepped away and looked at her mother, who said nothing. She only smiled with a reassuring look. In her outstretched hand was a streaming oatmeal muffin, one of Dinky's favorites. However, Dinky only stared blankly at it. She scowled as she looked back over her mother's equally blank face that only seemed to stare into nothingness. Her right eye rolled downwards in a most ridiculous look, even by Derpy standards. Dinky could stand it no more. She gritted her teeth and then screamed as she slapped the muffin out of Ditsy's hoof.
It's not fair!
She shrieked.
Why can't you ever talk to me? Why are your eyes so weird? Why are you so obsessed with these stupid muffins? Because of you I get made fun of every single day that my mommy isn't normal!
Ditsy looked shocked as she tried to embrace her daughter again. Dinky only slapped her hoofs away, and Ditsy could only stare silently with those rolling eyes, and while Dinky screamed at her.
Why aren't you normal? I hate you!
She pushed past her mom and ran upstairs to her bedroom and slammed the door. Dinky looked heartbroken as she held out an arm in supplication for her daughter to come back. As soon as the door shut, she shut her eyes and looked down in defeat. After a brief moment she opened them again, and in a rare moment her retina were aligned correctly. She walked over to the small writing desk, took out a quill and inkwell, and removed a small stack of papers from one of the drawers. She dipped the pen into the inkwell and continued to add to the final sheet of paper. Tonight was the night she would tell her everything. Dinky lay in bed that night, with the covers up to her neck. She was all out of tears as she tried to just fall asleep for the next day. Then came a knock on her door. She sat up and folded her forelegs with a pouty look on her face.
Don't come in,
She muttered. Regardless, Ditsy came into her daughter's dark room. Dinky folded herself under her comforter defiantly. Again, her mother said nothing. She tapped Dinky through her covers as a small plea to come out. Dinky consented grudgingly. She couldn't see very much until Derpy turned on her bedside lamp, bathing them in a warm incandescent glow. Dinky saw a stack of papers in her mother's mouth, which Ditsy motioned for her daughter to take.
What's this?
She asked. Though she knew she would get no verbal response, she only looked at her mother, who wore an expression that seemed to say, "Please read it." Dinky obliged. However, She couldn't believe what she saw once her eyes registered what was on the page. It was a draft of writing with the most beautiful calligraphy she had ever seen. It was perfectly legible. Not too fancy, yet it was a pleasure to look at. What an art it was that stretched across the paper.
Who gave you this?
Asked Dinky. Derpy pointed her arm towards herself with a modest smile.
You? You wrote this?
Asked Dinky quizzically. It didn't make any sense. This handwriting was probably better than Celestia's. Each letter curled and flowed with such grace and beauty into the next, like a river of ink, flowing gently with the guide of a quill. Nevertheless, she started to take in the words that her mother had written.
My dearest daughter Dinky, words can't describe the joy that I feel now that I finally get to tell you something I've wanted to say for a while. Ever since I heard about how you felt about me and how you were being teased and bullied only because of me, and ever since I felt your frustration at who I am, I know and feel your pain and frustration. I can't express how much I curse the powers that made me mute to the world, mute before my own daughter. I have no words in my mouth to comfort you with, only my shoulder to cry on as well as the muffins. I hope you realize that they mean something more to me than a simple pastry, dear daughter. To me, odd as this may sound, they symbolize one of the only forms of kindness I've ever known in this world. Although this isn't a happy story, please listen and know why I am the way I am, and why I love you dearly, my little Dinky Hooves.
The letter continued. All my life, I've also been the receiver of bullying. I was just vulnerable that way, but by now I've accepted my faults and the fact that others wonder and joke about how stupid I must be because I can't speak to prove them wrong, nor can I look them in the eye to be on their level. But know first, my daughter, that I am not dumb or stupid, or any less capable of critical thought than any other pony, though I know you would never think such a thing. I gave up long ago trying to write down my thoughts to my peers, who only laughed and ignored my notebook. I only give this to you because you are the only love I have in this world who would understand. My eyes were not always crossed as they are now. However, I've always been unable to speak. It caused my parents a panic that I was silent when I was born. The doctor quickly elevated their fear of a stillbirth, but their joy was short-lived when he explained that I was unable to utilize my vocal cords at all. I wouldn't be able to talk, cry, sing, or shout for the entirety of my life. But like any good parents, my mother and father loved me all the same. And it was this that saved me, and ruined me. My mother always doted me a bit more than necessary, in my opinion, and she was quite protective of me. That isn't to say that I was spoiled or none the like. She praised me when I did good in school and punished me when I needed to, and gave me a small present on my birthday and heartwarming Eve. She just seemed to always pay too much attention to me. Perhaps she was trying to compensate for my father's ambivalence. He too loved me, as any good father would, but make no mistake. However, he never really showed it. He was always disgruntled with the fact that his only daughter was a mute. He stifled his sorrows in a bit of drinking, but it never came down to anything more than that. However, other than my muteness, I was a perfectly normal filly. I did well in school, and I went to flight school in the summer. I also looked the part. On the outside, I was quite normal. Until one day, when, literally and figuratively, I saw the world from a whole new perspective. I was about your age when I got my cutie mark. For a while, I would love nothing more but in my spare time than to mix some dish soap with water and endlessly play with a rod and string to make bubbles. I loved how beautiful the colors of the rainbow appeared in those 3 orbs of all shapes and sizes. They jiggled as I giggled and they popped, a thing of such wonder that seemed to be alive with the spirits of its own, and so fragile. I especially loved them because I could play and dance with them, and they would never ask anything of me. I didn't need to talk. Blowing bubbles created a silent dream world for me that I could just glide through. Eventually, I became much better at the art of creating bubbles from learning techniques such as getting the right amount of soap and being careful in how forceful I was with the rod and the string. I found myself being able to blow bigger and bigger bubbles until one day I created one so big it could fit Princess Celestia inside twice. Immediately, I dunked myself into the bucket of soapy water till I was completely drenched. Then I slipped myself into the bubble. It was as if I were part of another world, Everything that happened in the outside I couldn't hear. It was silent, like me. Imagine my glee when a mark appeared on my flank. I didn't care what blowing bubbles couldn't get me a job I liked. It was who I was. My peers, however, found my cutie mark to be a laughing matter, and dangerously so. One day I was making an art piece of the slippery spheres floating about with the sky as my canvas, when I heard a splashing of water behind me. I turned around in horror to see some of my schoolmates had followed me to the Whitetail Woods, where I sometimes went to be alone, upset my bucket of soapy water. It wasn't the loss of my liquid that horrified me, but the fact that I was being laughed at again. Some of my classmates had always been assured of understanding my inability to speak. Thus, I was made a figure of ridicule by various cliques. But this was my private life they were mocking now. I didn't know how I could ever respond. I backed away and shut my eyes, hoping they would go away. However, I wish my eyes had been open for as long as possible so I could see the world clearly, just one last time. The next thing I felt above the noise of grating laughter of my classmates was a sharp force that hit me in the head, a large rock. I dropped to the ground, being unable to move. The laughter became dimmer either because I was falling unconscious or because they trotted away, chuckling at their joke. I would have screamed if I could have, with the blood and the dirt washing over my face. I woke up in a hospital to the sight of my parents crying hysterically as the doctor showed them pictures I didn't quite see. I learned later that he explained the potential damage of my concussion. When I fully came to my senses, I was to discover what that damage meant. The doctor looked at me, shook his head as he tried to get me to focus on the light he was shining in my eyes. Try as I might, I couldn't help but see double. He sighed when he went on about my eyes having been forced in a state of both eso and exotropia. That is why my eyes are the way they are. All for a laugh at my expense. My life would never be the same. The doctor nonchalantly tossed something onto my lap. It mattered not that my left eye looked down while the other looked up. I figured out then. All the tears fell all the same when they came pouring out of my eyes. Down, staining the sheets of my hospital cot, as I saw what it was the doctor gave back to me. Broken into pieces, when I must have fallen on it, was my bubble rod. Now you know, my daughter, that I was born mute, and how I became cross-eyed. I would like to say that my troubles ended here. However, that would only be partially true. I didn't acquire any peculiar traits, but I still only felt sorry for myself until I had you. Although, as soon as I recuperated and stepped back into the school, I knew that all the smiles directed to me were from Schadenfreude. I had no real friends. To them, I was just a freak. I was ditzy Derpy Hooves, and I swore to never blow bubbles again. However, I decided that this was no matter to keep me from living. At least I was capable of working a decent flyer. After school I decided to work for the Equestrian Mail Service. I needed a job right away, as my family needed money just as urgently. My father had slipped further and further away from reality ever since the accident. He calmly drank more than which was good for him, until one night he had succumbed to alcohol poisoning. My mother was on her own and barely able to work. I do thank my lucky stars today when I think of my small but generous salary. I had enough to support you and my mother. But for a long time I felt despondent, as my father had died and my mother was helpless. In that dark time I was truly and utterly alone. Whenever I went, the strain of laughter behind my back drilled into my brain. I couldn't take it anymore. That is, until I discovered compassion in its purest form. Years ago, I had delivered a package or two to a few addresses in Canterlot back when I was still a filly. I had to make the 3-hour trip in the pouring, freezing rain, far from Ponyville, to the high mountain citadel. The trip was also quite difficult when my eyes crossed one way or the other. I wasn't used to predicting the ways my eyes would roll, so I crashed quite a few times. Luckily, I delivered packages successfully without damage. I tried to put on a smile on my face in the freezing downpour as I knocked on the doors of the recipients. They cared not for the small, bruised, beaten filly out in the rain as they snatched their parcels and slammed the door shut in my face without even a tip. After the rounds, I was so starving I felt dizzy. I had a bit in my pocket as I looked for something to eat. Rounding a street corner, I smelled something wonderful. Baking. I saw a small pastry shop lit on the road. That was a dark, rainy day in Canterlot. The smells of sweet goods that emanated from the small bakery was the one that reminded me of home. I walked in, and the showcase caught my eye. On top was a fresh batch of steaming oatmeal muffins. My stomach growled furiously, yelling at me to take action while they were still hot. The kindly old stallion behind the counter caught my eyeing them as he beckoned me to dry off with a towel he tossed to me and come to purchase a muffin. After tossing him 2 bits I had in my pocket, all that I had for the day, he carefully took a muffin and handed it to me with a smile. I walked back outside under the awning, savoring the moment. I had never loved food so much in my life. I could only look and awe at it until my hunger got the better of me. I closed my eyes to take a bite until I felt something, or some pony shoved me. I opened my eyes to see a stranger passing by, yelling at me to get out of the way. I didn't mind so much until I realized my absence in my hoof. The muffin wasn't there anymore. I looked down to see my prize had fallen into the gutter. My eyes widened until I saw my now wet pastry disintegrate into the stream of water, passing onto the cobblestone road. Not only did I cry, if I could speak, would have started bawling. A small, freezing, lonely filly, sobbing over a muffin. It wasn't the only food I could get in a day. My stream of tears added drop by drop to the river of rainwater as I lamented over my dearly departed dinner, till I heard a cart coming down the street. Suddenly, the creaking of the wheels stopped, and I heard a heavenly feminine voice directed at me.
Oh, you poor dear.
I looked up and saw a shining aura coming from the majestic Princess Celestia herself. The goddess stepped down from her carriage and held me under her wing. Imagine, a regal princess sheltering a poor Pegasus filly on the streets from the rain. She started to fuss over me and asked questions such as what in the world I was doing in the rain like this without a coat, and that I must be starving, etc. I motioned to my muffin that lay in the gutter. It was the only explanation I could give. The princess figured out I was an employee of the mail service from my heavy satchel. She smiled and walked back into the bakery. I could only gawk and wonder why the most important pony in all of Equestria stopped to care for me. A moment later, she stepped back, levitating something with her magic. Words would fail me anyway if I would try to describe my disbelief. I smiled, and with tears of thanks, I stretched out my arm to receive what she had offered. It was a token of pure kindness. It was a favor of unconditional compassion. It was the purest form of love I had never received before. It was a hot muffin. It took a gentle prompt from the princess to finally take a bite, but I only looked up with a tear of joy still running down my cheeks. I wanted to ask, why me? Why me? I had never known such kindness before. It didn't quite register with me. She didn't even care that I couldn't see her clearly as one of my eyes rolled and crossed. She understood my look and made nothing of it. It was simply her responsibility to love, she said. And with that, she went back to her cart. She wished me a safe trip back home. I stood under the awning, staring at her gift. I felt a sensation I had never felt before. The smile I swore to always wear, rocked every nerve ending in my body. My throat tingled. I made a noise that I hadn't heard from me before. It was voice. Spurred by an act of kindness, I uttered a single word, the only word I'm able to utter to this day.
Muffin.
I whispered. I pounced happily on the treat, and I never felt so happy in my lifetime, even if my eyes still crossed about.
I don't expect my tale to mean much. However, I only wanted to tell you so you would know what made me who I am today, and, more importantly, never to let the insults of others make you wish you were something you aren't. It's okay that the words others say hurt. I learned that as long as kindness exists in this world, there's always something to smile about, no matter where life has led you. Perhaps this explains my apparent obsession with muffins. They remind me of kindness and unfound compassion that lives in every pony. They remind me of the love I thought I would never receive. I can't speak, but when I give you a muffin, it's my own special way of saying, I love you, Dinky. I love you with all my heart. Let not my cookie eyes fool you, nor my muteness leave you feeling alone. You are the reason I cry no more, for you mean the world to me, and I know you love me back. You will always be my dearest muffin. Mine, and mine alone.
Dinky paused. She rested the papers in her lap, dumbfounded, unable to look at her mother, who went through so much more than she'd ever would have thought. Tears began to form in her eyes, and Ditsy caught it, nudged her face up to hers. Their eyes met, sort of, as Ditsy only kept smiling reassuringly at her daughter.
I'm sorry, Mommy, about what I said earlier.
Ditsy shook her head and kissed Dinky on her forehead with a wish to good night. They looked at each other for the last time before morning. Ditsy's eyes rolled quizzically inwards as her trademark smile was still glued on. Dinky laughed uncontrollably as her mother grinned back. She turned off the lamp and shut the door. Dinky had never felt prouder to have a mom such as her. Such is the quiet Derpy Hooves. The end.